Welcome to the Doing Business in Africa podcast by Africa.com. I'm Lerato Molefe. Let's get started. On the 1st December 2024, China flipped a switch for 53 African countries with diplomatic ties. Zero-tariff treatment across the board, now set to run through April 2028. That is not a symbolic tweak. It makes Beijing the first major economy to offer unilateral, tariff-free access to Africa at this scale, and it lands in a trade relationship that is already huge. The numbers are worth sitting with for a second. China-Africa trade hit $348 billion in 2025. Then, in the first quarter of 2026 alone, trade was up 23.7% year-on-year to $94.6 billion. So this is not China opening a door into an empty room. The room is already crowded, busy, loud, containers moving, contracts being signed, suppliers adjusting, executives recalculating. Now, the easy headline is, great, Africa has access. But access alone does not equal industrial upgrading. It never has. If you're exporting unprocessed copper, raw cocoa, lithium concentrate, or basic agricultural commodities with zero tariffs, you may sell more of them. You may even sell them faster. But that is very different from building the factories, standard systems, logistics reliability, and working capital that turn trade access into manufacturing depth. And that's the real test. Over the next, roughly 2 years now? Can African producers move up the chain before the policy window narrows? Because April 2028 sounds generous until you remember how long industrial decisions take. Land, power, permits, equipment, supplier qualification, shipping contracts, financing lines. None of that happens because a tariff headline looked good on a Tuesday. The countries to watch are the ones with at least some industrial base already in place. South Africa, Morocco, Egypt, Kenya. Not because success is guaranteed there, but because they have the beginnings of the things this moment actually rewards. Manufacturing capability, export discipline, industrial zones, some skills depth, some logistics learning. That's where the window feels real. But here's the tension. China has effectively said, we will open our market. Africa still has to answer the much harder question. Open it with what? Finished garments? Auto components? Processed foods? Battery precursor materials? Pharmaceuticals? Or just more volume of what the continent already ships out at the bottom of the value chain? If you're an investor, this is where you have to be careful not to confuse trade growth with structural change. A 23.7% jump in Q1 2026 trade is impressive. It is also, potentially, a trap in the way strong top-line numbers can hide weak positioning. You can grow trade and still lose the next phase of value creation. In fact, that's often exactly how it happens. And if you're thinking, well, surely tariff-free access should naturally pull industry into place. I get that instinct. I had it too. But industry does not appear where incentives are merely attractive. Industry appears where the corridor works, the bank lends, the shipment arrives, the supplier gets paid, and the asset is controlled by someone willing to stay through the ugly years. Which is why this story very quickly stops being about tariffs and starts being about power, in a more practical sense. Take the Lobito corridor. For a long time, it sat in that familiar category of African mega-projects. Strategically elegant, widely discussed, financially fuzzy. That's changing. The Africa Finance Corporation is now in talks to raise between $3 and $5 billion from lenders including Citi, Standard Bank, Absa, and Ecobank, alongside equity stakes from Angola and Zambia. That is a different sentence. That's not concept, that's capital structure. And the strategic point is bigger than one rail and port story. Lobito is about whether Central and Southern African mineral and trade flows can be rerouted, accelerated, and financed through a corridor that changes who has leverage. Corridors decide timing. Timing decides margins. Margins decide who can afford to process, stock, ensure, and scale. So when people talk about infrastructure, I sometimes think we make it sound too passive. A corridor is not scenery. A corridor is power. You can see the same logic in banking. Equity Group's push into Angola, Zambia, and Mozambique is not random expansion. It tracks the trade routes. Follow the cargo, follow the customers, follow the payments. In other words, don't build a banking map around colonial borders on an old atlas. Build it around where goods, working capital, and settlement demand are actually going next. That matters because banks are not just spectators to industrialization. They decide who gets inventory finance, trade credit, foreign exchange access, transaction rails, payroll systems, supplier onboarding, all the boring things that, in reality, determine whether a manufacturer can survive long enough to become competitive. The glamorous version of industrial policy is a ribbon cutting at a factory. The real version is often a bank deciding whether a medium-sized exporter can bridge 90 days without collapsing. Then there is Ambatovy in Madagascar, and this is the other half of the same story. Sumitomo is paying $418 million to exit after billions invested and major losses. That's a brutal number, and also a revealing one. A distressed asset in a strategically important battery minerals chain is changing hands at a price that gives a South African-led consortium a relatively cheap entry into something large, difficult, and geopolitically relevant. So yes, on paper, that's a nickel deal. In practice, it's a question about who picks up stressed mineral assets after the first wave of international capital gets burned. Who has the patience, the balance sheet, the operating appetite, and maybe the regional understanding to take control when sentiment is low? Because that is often where real ownership shifts. Not at the top of the cycle when everyone is optimistic, but in the messier handover after losses. And I have to say, one thing journalism teaches you very quickly is that the loudest growth story is not always where value ends up. Sometimes, value ends up with the entity that owns the route, writes the loan terms, or buys the troubled asset when everyone else wants out. That's less romantic than the big summit speech, maybe, but it's usually closer to the truth. Put those three pieces together: Lobito, Equity Group, Ambatovy, and a single theme emerges. The next phase of African value creation will not be controlled only by whoever extracts the resource or signs the trade deal. It will be controlled by whoever organizes movement, financing, and ownership at the same time. Corridor, bank, asset. That's the triangle. Which brings us back to China's tariff shift. Zero tariffs create opportunity, absolutely. But if the transport spine is financed elsewhere, the trade finance is captured elsewhere, and distressed strategic assets are acquired by players with deeper staying power, then Africa can still end up participating in growth without fully owning it. That's the tension I wouldn't understate. So the question for the next 2 years is not simply whether exports to China rise. They probably will. The question is whether enough African firms, banks, and states can use this access window to lock in processing capacity, logistics control, and asset ownership before April 2028 turns from a deadline on paper into a missed industrial moment in hindsight. That's the briefing. See you next time.